about decss. So this is not about what it does or who wrote it or whatever. This is more session about politics or law, which is one of the reasons I restrict myself to analog media, so there's no beamer in here. I want to present some background information about decss and especially about the forces fighting for CSS, SMI, immediate trial, and etc. And probably pose some more questions than I will propose answers. And I've planned for about 30 minutes of presentation and then a lot of time for answers and questions. And I want to start with introducing myself. I was one of the persons sued in the first decss case, namely in California, by the decss. And I was the one who set up the original decss mailing list, which most of you will probably never have heard of because it was closed and restricted to defendants and friendly attorneys and other people who could help us. And if you enter the term decss into Google today, you'll probably find on my website, lemuria.org, as the #1 hit. So I've been involved in this for quite some time, and over the past 20 months, we've gathered a lot of background information and information about who exactly is fighting us. And that is what I want to present today. And start by going back a little in history. My personal involvement started in November 1999 when I set up the decss mirror at lemuria.org. That was about a month after decss was published on the internet first. CSS, the content scrambling system, was already existing for about 3 years by then, and DVD piracy was already widespread. We have reports from an organization called the International Intellectual Property Alliance, which collects numbers about piracy in different countries around the world and tries to estimate how much damage it does to the movie industry. And for 1998, they already have widespread DVD piracy in mostly Asia. So these pirates didn't need and didn't care for decss. They made perfect digital copies, including the so-called copy protection. Nevertheless, decssa, which is the licensing organization for the CSS license, sued everyone in this talk on December 27, 1999. And the MPAA joined later in January with the well-known lawsuit against 2600. The reason why the 2600 lawsuit caused a lot more press and is because only the MPA sued about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and the California lawsuit's actually about trade secrets. Somehow they believe that John Johansson in Norway got hold of the trade secret they kept in California. However, that went. The other reason is that parts of the DMCA were actually fresh from the presses and had just went into effect on January 1st, 2000. So the end of 1999 lawsuit couldn't possibly prosecute these clauses. The US has a DMCA, and in Europe we will soon have a very similar law, which is based on the European Copyright Directive. And both of these go back to the TRIPS and other WTO agreements. WIPO and WTO are not exactly in the spotlight, especially not in the mainstream media, which is why I want to include a short overview of their history. This is how it all started, basically. In 1883 and 1886, there were two conventions in Paris and Bern. The Bern Convention is very well known because it laid the foundation for worldwide copyright as we know today. 1893 was the year where the first enforcement agency was created for this new copyright agreement, which is called DERPI, which is the French abbreviation for the full term, which is United International Bureau for the Protection of Intellectual Property. DERPI and the conventions focus exclusively on intellectual property, specifically copyright and later trademark and patent laws. Out of all these early conventions was formed the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, whereas in the wake of World War II, International Trade Organization, or GATT, was formed, and GATT was later more formalized into the World Trade Organization. And in 1996, the World Intellectual Property Organization and the World Trade Organization crafted an agreement to work together on intellectual property issues. Some facts down there. Both of these agencies are located in Geneva. The WIPO is a UN agency. The WTO is based on the TRIPS Treaty. Both of them have more than 100 member countries, and both of them have budgets ranging several $1 million, $250 million from the WIPO. The interesting fact that the WIPO is one of the very few UN agencies which is actually paying its own bills, namely by collecting fees for the work it does in managing intellectual property. In short, the World Trade Organization is the body which sets the rules, and the WIPO is an administrative organization dealing with questions of contract law when it involves multinational affairs. So both the DMCA and the European Copyright Directive go back to the TRIPS agreement, and the TRIPS agreement is special in that it is a prescriptive piece of legislation, which means that it must be enforced. The other WTO treaties are of a different kind in that they tell the state what it may not do. So you may not enact a law that says this matter. Whereas the TRIPS is a treaty that says within this time span you have to enact a law that defines how you deal with copyright infringement. However, nothing in TRIPS forces the national legislative institutions to create a law that is like the DMCA, especially the harsh anti-circumvention rules are not required by TRIPS, but are, on the contrary, the result of very purposeful and intentional lobbying. One of the first outfalls of DMCA is the CSS license, because it was crafted intentionally to take advantage of the DMCA. We know that the number one purpose of the CSS license is to create a tie-in between the so-called technical protection measure and the law that disallows circumvention of this measure. Because we have found a World Intellectual Property Organization workshop document from a Time Warner analyst and a DVD CCA lawyer, which is quite clear on what the main purpose of the whole CSS license is. I quote, "Current efforts at building copy protection structures have demonstrated the need for a three-pronged approach. The first prong involves the development of technical protection measures and the making available of such measures on reasonable terms. The second prong consists of laws that support protecting technologies and prohibit the circumvention of such technologies. The third prong involves cross-industry negotiations and licenses of technical protection measures." In other words, these guys tell their industry what we need to do is we create some technical thing that protects our stuff, then we make circumventing it illegal, and just to be sure, we create a license that ties everyone who is in the game so closely together that they can't break out. And they even go so far that they took into account several years ago that which we hear today from the anti-DMCA movement, namely that we should make illegal the conduct and not the devices. Jail people for pirating DVDs, not for playing them on Linux. In the same document, there's a whole chapter devoted to this very question, and the conclusion is that for several reasons, the conduct-only approach is insufficient. So that which we are lobbying for today, namely to make only the actual conduct illegal, has already been taken into account, and the lobby groups of the movie mafia have decided to not take this approach. So whenever we argue for that, we can expect fierce resistance. There is also a recommendation from another player in the ever-expanding process, the global business dialogue on electronic commerce, that specifically recommends that national law should prohibit devices too, even though the Vapor Treaty does not require it.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, the CSS license is only available under NDA.
Do you have some headphones?
There are a few PDF files with procedures on the DVDCCA website, a number of references to the license on the DVD FLLC website, which is the former local licensing
Mixer to the camera,
which
from the camera
licenses
to
the
the
DVD logo,
encoder.
which you see
So this is
on
first.
all the DVD players on discs. But in the presentation, John Hoy, the president of DVDCCA, mentions that
go from the
CSS
microphone
license
input
consists
to
of,
the camera,
quote,
and then from the
280
audio output
carefully
out
crafted
the encoder.
pages.
So the camera is input.
Until someone violates the NDA and
well,
leaks
that
the actual
get
document,
audio.
and I'm sure both Crypto and my website will instantly publish it.
Let's see all the
This is all we know about the actual
Okay.
content.
Um,
There are some glimpses in it. For example, we all know that region codes are enforced only in the CSS license. But the license seems to be much more specific than that. For example, there's an FAQ at dvddemystified.com which mentions that the CSS license disallows digital PC and sound output at 96 kilohertz and instead requires players to downsample to 48 kilohertz, which is a very specific requirement for a license on an encryption scheme that has nothing whatsoever to do with audio. So the CSS license creates outright crippled DVD players. Region coding, unskippable FBI warnings, even advertisement on some DVDs, restrictions on output format, macrovision, no screenshots, no excerpts, you name it. The result is widespread control far beyond the rights granted by copyright. And Europe is currently investigating the DVD price structure. You may know that DVDs are on average 50% more expensive in Europe than in the United States, even though they are released about 6 months later. Especially region coding is a dream come true for Hollywood. Publishing setups in the publishing studios. For example, the movie Titanic is distributed in the United States and in Europe by different movie companies.
yeah, but
So
this is
what is region
from my
coding doing there? Well, easily. several legal bodies, with the LMI, the License Managing Incorporated, this being the central management instance, and the foresee entity is taking over future technologies. For example, down to the right you see CSS2 will be licensed by foresee entity, not by DVD-CCA. Because, in fact, DVD-CCA, foresee entity, LMI, and probably DTLA are one and the same organization. They don't only have the same president, they also have the same postal address. And these are the organizations behind many of the recent and famous control technologies. DVD-CCA is the licensing body for CSS. Foresee entity is behind the CPRM hard disk encryption and several watermarking technologies. DTLA licenses DTCP, which is one of the technologies trying to encrypt the signing all the way from the CD to your speakers. And LMI is just a central management institution for all of these. So, why the smokescreen of no less than 4 different organizations and a 5th one being planned? One of the reasons is that there are varying partners in crime. Intel and IBM are members of foresee, but only Intel is playing in the DTLA, together with Sony and Hitachi, which in turn are not involved in foresee. However, judging from the history of this organization, I do assume that the actual purpose is slightly different, namely that someone has taken extreme care to make an arrangement that is as complex and as bulletproof as possible, and the main reason is almost surely an attempt at exploiting the law on the one hand, and on the other hand, to avoid cartel and antitrust investigations. In all, the DVD technology is surrounded by a closely knit network of organizations that license the technology itself, the CSS encryption, the logo, and several other issues. And it is also protected by pretty much every license agreement, trademark protection, and other legal and organization protection known to man. It's quite obvious that it was set up by someone very paranoid. Because even though the sheer number of organizations and license agreements involved is mind-boggling, the number of actual players is very small. Just one example, and the other players are definitely equally deep in. Toshiba worked on the DVD technology with Warner in 1993, then with Matsushita on CSS in 1996. These 3 also are founding members of both the DVD Forum and DVD FLLC. Toshiba then acted as interim licensee for CSS until DVD, CCA, and 3 other organizations were founded, and all of them are headed by a former Toshiba employee. So the DVD technology, which could open us up to a lot of incredible things, for example, several gigabytes on a CD-shaped disk, is controlled by a cartel with just a handful of players who intentionally try to paint themselves in much greater diversity than actually exists. Their extreme reactions towards the free software movement and any attempt to create, for example, a free software or even Linux player have been very aggressive. We have on record several companies who applied for a CSS license for a Linux player and were denied. So I believe what they do is fear competition. They want to keep a market that they have carefully cornered all to themselves. And it appears that they will be successful in doing that in the short run because of the second prong, the DMCA and the European Copyright Directive, which is in the United States already in place, and in Europe is currently marching towards us, because the directive has been passed on April 9, 2001. This is it. And it is very similar to the DMCA, both in spirit and in parts, even the actual words being used.
Okay, perfect.
So the central bad point of all these laws is that the circumvention of technical protection measures is illegal, no matter what the intent is. And the very problem with the intent not being taken not being recognized in court is that the very people who manage all the licensing system have purposely voted and lobbied for an attack that goes on the devices, not on the intent. There are narrow exceptions for critical research in other cases, but as we've seen in Professor Felton's case, they are at best weak. And what we're heading to is that some years from now, even in Europe, you can't publish anymore without fear of being sued. So academic freedom has been done away with, and free software with it. And as you all know, Dmitry Sklyarov has been arrested on decss charges, so the point where it stops being funny has been reached. However, the laws are in place, or are being created in Europe, and this is definitely not a fight that can be won in the short run, because people like these have been lobbying for the exact laws that we have today for, I would guess, the last 10 years. However, there are efforts currently going on in Europe to stop the European DMCA or do what we can to make sure that the national implementations of it are enough to satisfy the TRIPS agreement, because there is no way around TRIPS anymore, but are less harsh than the DMCA. And I would like to invite you all to, if you want to do something against DMCA and the fact that it's coming to Europe and it's coming very fast, then join us. There's a mailing list at eurorights.org, or you can mail me directly. I will write that down in a second. And we are still trying to do something against this, because DMCA is currently in the United States, but it is coming to us. Any questions while I write the content?
What can you do to stop it? You need to raise public awareness.
Yes.
And nobody in the street stands for all of these
The current status is that the directive has passed the European Commission, which means that it has to be enacted into national laws within a specific time frame, I believe 18 months. So the next step is national legislation. And surely the first drafts are being written as we speak. So the only hope to avoid being arrested in Europe for writing software is to put pressure on the national governments so that the laws they enact are not an equivalent of the American DMCA. I do know that we need to get greater publicity in order to move somewhere. However, there's also the fact that intentional lobbying can accomplish much more than the number of people behind it. The lobbying of the movie industry, for example, is being done by a handful of people, but a handful of people who are doing nothing else. Pardon? Yes, with incredible budgets behind.
Any ideas how to make more public awareness?
How we do more public awareness? Well, that is one of the reasons why we need more people to be conscious of this in the technical area. We've all heard of DMCA, we've all heard of decss. However, it's come to a surprise, as a surprise even to us who were deeply involved in the whole affair, that it is not an accident that the harsh anti-circumvention provisions in the DMCA were not a misunderstanding, but were intentionally created. And I believe that once the technical people realize that there's actually someone trying to put us in jail actively, then we can go on from there and convince regular people that DMCA is a bad law.
Are there known cases of conviction?
Pardon?
There are known convictions for criminal law today.
Yes, there are by now a great number of Linux DVD players which use DCSS. However, none of them are commercial or otherwise what the, well, let's say the general public considers official. So they're still underground hits. I use one of them myself, and they're getting better than the Windows, the authorized players actually. But they're in no shop. There is no hardware DVD player which is not licensed by DVD CCA. So up to now, the cartel is pretty much still intact.
They cannot contribute any non-commercial organization, or just because they are not known.
Well, they are not known, yes. Outside the Linux community, for example, very few people have heard of non-commercial DVD players.
What against are they opposed to the source version, or to the, I mean, comment that they are specific against a operating system?
That's a good question. I do believe they are specifically against unauthorized players, because the CSS license, which is 218 pages long, will definitely have a lot of regulations in it that they have no other means of enforcing. You can enforce that it may not make copies by copyright law alone. You can enforce a lot of other provisions by other legislation that it makes contributory infringement illegal, for example. But stuff like region coding is nowhere in the law. So the only way to enforce it is this third prong, the cross-industry license agreement. And that's why I believe the resistance against free software DVD players or against technical details of the working is so harsh, because it allows people to create DVD players without signing the CSS license, and thus evading all the restrictions and other control measures that are defined therein.
Are there any historical parallels at all you would draw between what's happening now and anything that's gone before?
Well, I'm not a historian, but the best thing I can think of is actually the church's reaction to printing machines. Because you have a very small group of people who are currently producing the entertainment content, the mass media content, and they are pretty afraid of other people breaking into that market.
Does that mean you can't actually master a DVD from use in normal players without accessing the CSS coding?
No, there are actually several layers of protection against that. One is that the blank DVDs that you buy are pre-burned in the key sector, so you cannot use CSS encryption at all, even if you have a license. The other is that the consumer-grade DVD recorders will not allow you. And the third reason is that, again, the blank DVDs that you buy are of considerably lower quality and density than those used in movies. I believe you can buy 4.7 GB DVDs now, but the ones that are used for Hollywood movies generally have twice the capacity.
Is that not in some way then a barrier to entry into that market?
It definitely is, yes.
Is that open to challenge?
Well, the whole purpose of this complicated setup where you have a large number of companies involved with various licenses back and forth is probably to make the whole setup imperious to attack. Because if there were one entity which would license the DVD logo and the CSS license, then it would be very easy to say this is a cartel. However, with more than a dozen companies that you have, if you want to break into the market, if you want to start a company that creates, say, DVD players, then you have to contact more than a dozen companies to get the necessary technical specification, licenses, the logo license, etc. And that is very difficult to attack on antitrust grounds.
Anyone in trouble for publishing the well-known fine number of instructions of the express algorithm?
Can you come a little bit off? I can't hear you.
Do you know if anyone got in trouble for publishing this prime number of instructions onto the extract the algorithm?
Okay, the question was whether anyone got into trouble for publishing the prime number, which was found to be a GSIP version of DCSS. I don't know for sure if anyone got into trouble, but I seriously expect yes, because they actually did include copyleft in the California list of defendants, and copyleft did nothing else but print t-shirts with DCSS on it. So I'm pretty sure we have a prime number that is illegal, yes.
My name is Andreas Vogt. I'm with the Chaos Computer Club of Germany. I'm operating the Vivid mailing list, which was the beginning of the DCSS development. And I'm also head of research and development and conversions, where we develop Linux-based TV solutions such as DVD players and digital TV reception. And yes, we do have a working DVD player under Linux, and there are 2 more companies in the market. And no, we cannot sell it because our boss refuses to sign the license, and because it would put us all in trouble, because basically doesn't trust the hackers in the company. Yeah, but what I would like to talk about is that the DMCA is a much bigger problem than that is apparent just by the fact that we cannot write software for our favorite operating system. Problem is on a much bigger scale. If you look at digital television, for instance, that's the new thing to come. Analog television will be turned off by 2006 to 2010, depending on the country. Then the only thing you will have left is digital TV. And now the receiver for your digital TV will be provided by the cable network operator. So you get a box there. And basically the guy at the other end can control what you can see and what you cannot see. And much more important, he can control what you can record and what you can't record. So what they think is that you shouldn't record the movie which is running on pay TV, but if you want to see it again, you have to pay again. So you go to a central server, do video on demand, look at it again, and that's even enough. But the real problem is that it will be impossible to keep private archives of the news, for instance. So nobody will have any recording of the news anymore, but there will be one central place where all the news are stored. I don't know how many of you have read the 1984, there's a saying in it which goes, those who control the past control the present, and those who control the present control the future. So basically they are getting a shitload of power into their hands because they will be able to control history. And an interesting connection I've seen in Italy, where you all have heard about Genua and about how the police raided a school where some journalists were sleeping who produced the indiemedia.org content and who were beaten and tortured and denied their rights. And terrorism or state terrorism or fascism to happen is Berlusconi. And Berlusconi is one of the big three guys in the media industry in Europe, together with Kirch in Germany and Murdoch in Great Britain. And he's the one who paid the lobbyists, guys. So it's fascism from both sides, and we have to be very, very careful because our fundamental human rights are being denied to us. It's not just about writing software for your favorite operating system. Thank you.
He is of course right, but I do believe that if we want to effect any change, and we have to start with something where we can really put the finger in the wound, where we can really say, here's something that you are doing wrong, and we know why, and we know how to do it better, and most importantly, we know why you are doing it, and it's greed. It's not for the better of humanity, it's just that you want more money. They do, but the public doesn't.
Can I just one comment on what you just said? I mean, in general, I guess you're right. There's a specific comment about the news not being able to be updated. And that's a very big assumption that happens naturally here in the Netherlands. The news is actually broadcast and is available via the internet for everybody to download. So I don't really find that kind of argument. If you have a public broadcast operation who's broadcasting this kind of information,
Any more questions?
As you said before, now it's going the Islam to the national debt. How big is the range? How much can these countries decide on for themselves?
There are two different laws that the national government has to obey, namely the TRIPS Treaty, which is very loosely defining that there has to be a national law that protects intellectual property and that makes anti-circumvention, or that takes anti-circumvention into account. It doesn't say what the penalties have to be, it doesn't say that they have to be criminal penalties, so there's a lot of leeway in the TRIPS Treaty. There's also now the European Directive, which is quite detailed. It runs 17 pages, and the national government will also have to take that into account. And of course, an overshooting approach is one which makes sure that you have satisfied all the requirements. So by making everything illegal and throwing people into jail, you can at least be sure that you have satisfied your international obligations. However, there's still a lot of room to define, for example, what exactly the penalties are, what the exemptions are, for example, what is effective technical protection measure, how do we define encryption research, and do we make an exemption for fair use, for example. All these things are still open to national governments. So while the general direction is very bad at the moment, there's still some things that the national government can do if it cares.
Question. What are the chances of the DCMA in the States being overturned by a First Amendment grounds?
Well, ask that to a US lawyer. The DMCA is law in the United States, so the only thing that can overturn it is either, well, a law that takes it down, which I'm pretty sure will not happen, or a Supreme Court decision that it's unconstitutional. And I believe there's hope there, because the DMCA clearly is overbroad. So the Supreme Court will, whenever it faces the first DMCA case, which may be pretty soon, strike at least parts of the law, I'm fairly sure.
So by tackling the problem on the national level, is there not a chance of getting rid of it on the European level?
Yeah, it's definitely the goal, because as long as this European Commission directive is in effect, the European countries will be forced to adopt such legislation. So the The problem is that this directive has passed, so there's nothing we can do to fight it before the time for turning it into national law runs up. So we have to concentrate on the national level at the moment, but the goal is definitely to go back to European level and ask for a redraft of this law.
A realistic chance that if you have enough nations that want to get rid of it, that it's going to be...
Yes, definitely. There are several international treaties on stuff like biological weapons which have died simply because one country has refused to sign it. In most cases, the United States, but there are other cases. For example, on the history cheat sheet that I put up, there was an organization prior to WIPO which had almost the same purpose. It was called ITO, and it died in 1950 because the US government refused to ratify the treaty that founded this organization. So with all international treaties, there's always the way out to just ignore it. Yeah, I hope so too, though I sometimes have my doubts. The question was why the directive passed, even though our elected representatives should be bright enough to see the bad points. When you read stuff like the WIPO workshop document that we found somewhere floating around on the WIPO website, you realize that the content protection lawyers do have a number of convincing arguments. I wouldn't say they're good arguments, but they're quite convincing. And of course, it's all about the poor artists, and well, civilization will end if we don't make circumvention illegal. And it's not all bullshit, and that's the problem. Because they start from an assumption that the representatives will instantly agree on, and then paint themselves as experts and say, okay, we agree that content needs to be protected. And we, the experts, say, this is how you can do it. And unfortunately, our representatives are used to listening to experts because, of course, they can't do everything. I mean, in a time frame of a week or so, they vote on anything from child protection to some car safety law to intellectual property stuff. So they are used to listening to their experts. Exactly. The problem is that the experts are not independent. The workshop for the people which was held by an analyst for Time Warner and a lawyer for DVD CCA, so probably the same guy who's suing me. And they are definitely partial. But they still had a workshop for all the world leaders.
Is there any European law that protects us from like a web of companies like they have for the live streaming?
I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know exactly whether or not there is a law. I do know that there are various antitrust and cartel laws, etc. And I do believe that the very reason for a complicated setup of license agreement companies, etc., is to evade these laws. And since the people who set up the system are lawyers themselves, I think it's pretty well approved.
What's your stake in this as a victim of a lawsuit? What's the worst that can happen to you, and what are you prepared to do in response? For example, are you likely to abandon your work and become a street cleaner instead of going to jail, or will you move to Antarctica where there are no laws against your publications?
Yeah. So, okay, what worries me and what my stake in I will definitely not travel to California for the next century. So, also, the very same organizations which work on the DMCA and similar stuff are also pushing something that's called the Hague Convention. Richard Stallman wrote a very devastating article about the Hague Convention, and there's also one on my website about the same topic. Basically, the Hague Convention says that for civil and commercial things that you do somewhere else, you can be sued there, even if you live in a different place. The basic intent is, imagine a tourist from Australia coming to visit, and he damages something or steals your car or whatever, and then he goes back to Australia. You basically have nothing you can do, and the intent of the Hague Convention is that you can't sue him in a Dutch or German or English or whatever court, and that whatever decision the court reaches will be enforced in Australia. That's the basic idea, and it's a good idea. However, there's a problem when it comes to the internet. The motion to dismiss or to quash service that Matthew Pavlovich made in the California case, arguing that he is living in Texas and he has never been to California before, and therefore they shouldn't sue him in California, was denied very recently. So, because it said that with this distribution over the internet and the knowledge that the movie industry is located in California, he is putting himself under the jurisdiction of the California Code. So once the Hague Convention is passed, I'm pretty sure that a lot of these cases will be taken up according to it, and it will be said that you have damaged the movie mafia in California, so we sue you here in California, and then we take it to a German court, and according to the Hague Convention, the German court has to enforce this. Whatever is in there, even if there's no basis in German law, the court has to enforce this judgment. There are a very few number of exemptions to that, and most of them are pretty crap. They're ineffectual and they don't do anything. What? No, the Hague Convention is limited to civil and commercial matters, and the death penalty is so far not being handed down. Okay, time is almost up, so one more question.
It's a fact, I think, that the powers of DCSS throughout. I think that most large powers are still going down using this. So, how come that the movie industry still seems successful to portray DCSS as an evil hand tool to pirate movies?
Yeah, how does the movie industry convince everyone that DCSS is a pirate tool? I have no idea, honestly. I really have no idea, because
What are their arguments in court?
the arguments in court are very convoluted. The main line of attack is that DCSS can be used to pirate movies. No question there. You can rent a movie and rip it to your disc, which is actually legal in some countries, illegal in others. I believe it's illegal in America. And they then say that that is the main purpose, so the primary use. And once the primary use of something is to circumvent technical protection measure, it's illegal. But
it basically just use hacker hysteria and say, oh, they're all terrorists.
yes.
Yeah, okay.
It's
the intelligence not subject to this hysteria.
well, the main problem is that it's rhetoric, it's not logic. Well, I think that's time for closing the session. If anyone has any other questions, or you need to get in contact and haven't written that address. My email address is tom@lemuria.org. If you don't know how to spell Lemuria, put DCSS into Google, and one of the first hits will be my site. Thank you.